What is development and what is growth? And what happens if you apply the same measurements of development to all places around the world? That's what we're talking about this lesson in Geography of Oceania. We're going to get started right now.
Giraon and me lifelong you me. Giraon and me lifelong you me. Thingy mon beginning it belong you me. You me sana long rights belong you me. Not developing country belong you me. But you me come up long behind time. Giraon and me lifelong you me. Giraon and me.
Okay, so in our last lesson, we were talking about developmentalism and the introduction of development policies and objectives in the region of Oceania, and some of the confusion and challenges that people were finding about when they were trying to do this. So, for instance, there's a big puzzle, right? So if you don't remember this, go back and check out the previous lesson. So there was the puzzle that development professionals were encountering, right? Which had to do with well-being and basic needs, and then income levels, right? And so there was an assumption that if you didn't have very much income, then your ability to meet basic needs would be very poor, very low ability or very low capacity. And this wasn't the case in Oceania. And we introduced this term or this phrase called the village mode of production, which one of our geographers that we are referencing here, Ray Waters, he developed to talk about a specific type of economy that was going on in Oceania that did not rely on those fundamental characteristics of a capitalist economy, which had to do with private property and with markets. Okay, village mode of production had different fundamentals through which it operated. All right, and we kind of ended that discussion by talking about what were some of the challenges that were going to come out of this. Like, why would development professionals really have an issue with the village mode of production? So that's what we're going to pick up on right now this time. One of our next things that I'm going to have you do is to read part of the first chapter of a book called Theories of Development. And this book is not focused specifically on Oceania. It kind of takes a global approach to development, but it has some really great questions and some really good discussion points that are going to help us understand what's going on here. So in Theories of Development, which is written by Richard Peet and Elaine Hartwick, it's asking a question of what is growth and what is development? And is there a difference between those two words? And does it matter that there's a difference? All right, so this starts by just making us think, what is development, first of all? And so it goes into this idea that development, on the one hand, is a really simple idea. It just means making a better life for everyone, or this idea that we can have progress, that we can build a world that gets better for everybody. Well, what does this mean? It means, things like basic needs. So having enough healthy food, right, to live healthy, a safe, healthy place to live. It means affordable services available to everybody. It means being treated with dignity and respect. So it's talking about these in a general sense. And these are not ideas that have just come out over the past few years. It really kind of goes back a few hundred years back to really the Enlightenment period in Europe, when there was this kind of shift in philosophy emerging from Europe that, we can use rationality and our powers of science and democracy to just improve the world, and we can use our intellect and our capacities to just improve the living conditions, in the world in which we live. So what is involved with this? Well, if you're going to do this thing, it's a really big deal. It's a huge project to try to accomplish this. It deals with multiple systems. It deals with social, cultural, natural environment. It deals with economic systems, and then they kind of reference this idea in that chapter that I'm posting for you. They say, maybe this is something that cannot be achieved, but at the same time, we kind of have to try to do it because it is one of those things, one of those characteristics of modern society, that this idea that we are a modern world, right? Modernity. the idea of development and the goal of achieving development is a core fundamental characteristic of modernity. And so it cannot be abandoned, right? That's what they're saying is like, maybe we can achieve it, but we can't just give it up, because if we give it up, then we're giving up everything, right? Everything that has to do with being a modern world or modern society. So this reading kind of poses this tension between, and on the one hand, it's a very simple idea, making the world better for everybody. But on the other hand, it's extremely difficult to actually make this happen. What they're kind of saying is that this definition of development that they're giving you, that is tied to the idea of modernity, that is kind of a true, untarnished definition of development, right? So let's get some definitions really clear so that we're not confused moving forward. Is that in the chapter Growth versus Development? Okay, they're saying that there's kind of the true definition of development means making a better life for everybody. And it has to take into account all sorts of things, right? Social, cultural, natural environment, like everything, right? Everything that there is. What they also are saying here is that true definition of development has gotten a little bit hidden and a little bit erased in maybe the past 100 years or so, right? Kind of really since after World War II, right? When developmentalism really became kind of defined and started to become like a big thing, a big deal. So what they're saying is the true definition of development has gotten hidden and erased and kind of buried a little bit under another definition, kind of what they're thinking of as like kind of a fake definition of development, which really means economic growth. All right. So in the effort to kind of do development, one of the things that happened was, how do you measure it, right? It's so complicated, right? It's so complex, right? All of those things that we're talking about when it comes to development, it's so complex. So how do you measure something so complex? So whenever you try to measure something, anything, right? You might run into a problem of oversimplifying things in order to measure, right? Because there's so much out there, so many complex things. So development kind of turned into a more conventional mainstream definition where when people talk about development, they're actually talking about economic growth. All right, so what does that mean? We got to figure that out. So economic growth means increasing the size of the formal economy. So that's what the reading is going to talk about, right? It says, conventionally, economic growth means achieving a more massive economy, producing more goods and services on the one side of the national account, right? That means basically a country, right, producing more goods and services, right? So kind of just selling more things, producing more things that get sold. And then on the services side, like doing more things, right, that get paid for on the formal market. When this happens, when you shift from that true original definition of development and narrow it down, and you create a very narrow definition of development, which just means economic growth, then you touch off like a cascading series of effects. And these effects kind of create so many different things that are going on that we kind of forget that original idea. So what they say here in the reading is that economic growth essentially occurs when more productive resources are employed to produce more goods and services. So in other words, they're saying that economic growth happens when land, when other resources, when workers, when factories and buildings and equipment, when they're all used to produce more goods and services. So all of those things, right, that we have when people and land and equipment are all put to use producing goods and services for sale. That's how we increase economic growth. So remember back to our previous lesson about what is development and our introduction to development, where we talked about in places where you need income just to survive, this might make a little bit of sense. So if you need income just to provide basic needs, then surely it makes sense to put every resource there is in a society or in a country to work as much as possible to produce things that can be sold on the market. Because by doing so, you're going to produce, you have maximized your potential for generating income. So just make sure, if this is a little bit unclear, go back and rewind, watch it again. But basically what you need to remember here is that there's a true original definition of development, and that has gotten conflated, right, or kind of combined in the past few decades with economic growth. So that now, in the mainstream assumption of developmentalism, development and economic growth are the same thing. That if there's economic growth, then that means that there's development, right? They have been combined, and people will say that those are the same thing. So there are some problems with this, that that first chapter on growth versus development starts pointing out in more of a global sense. And then we're going to move into some more specific issues when it comes to Oceania. All right, so there's a few problems that happen when we combine development and growth, when we conflate them or think that they are the same thing. The first problem is that an economy can grow and an economy can increase in size without actually providing development. And this is actually this is very factual, that the economy increases, right? The statistics that we use to measure the size of the formal economy, that official size of the economy, that can grow, and it has grown without actually addressing things like poverty, right? And the issue is we have to look at where do the benefits of that economic growth actually go? And so this is why you might have heard a lot of conversations or discussions in the past about economic inequality or income inequality. Right? So this is part of where that comes in, is that if an economy grows and that translates into income, if all of that income gets concentrated in certain parts of society, then development isn't really happening because it's just those benefits are unequally being realized. So one issue is that economy or economic growth does not translate directly into development. So the economy can grow and it might not actually have an effect on development. And actually, things can actually get worse because of that economic growth, right? As we've seen, you can see in the book, there's some statistics about the relationship between the incomes of different countries around the world and how much carbon dioxide emissions are associated with it. So the richer countries on a per capita basis have more carbon dioxide that's being produced than people that are living in poorer countries. Alongside this first issue that we're talking about right now is that there's an assumption built into this, that income translates directly into well-being and happiness. All right. And so we've talked about, previously, that in places where income is needed just to survive, right, where you just have to have money to pay rent and you need money to buy food for that has some effect, right? There's some truth there. But even in places where this is true, like after you reach a certain level of basic needs, it has been pretty well documented that, adding income does not, directly translate into more happy. Like, does it increase your happiness or increase your well-being that much more than you did when you just weren't able to meet basic needs? So even in rich countries that kind of depend a lot on incomes, right, more income doesn't necessarily translate into more happiness. So these are some of the first issues, right, with when you conflate development with economic growth, that you are assuming that increasing the economy or increasing the size of the economy is going to lead to development. And you're also assuming that increasing incomes are going to lead to increased well-being and happiness. And we could probably use some examples from your own personal life to kind of see this, right? So, and we're going to have to talk about economic statistics here in just a minute. Okay. So, but one thing is when we're talking about economic growth is we've got to measure it, right? So one of the issues here is we're trying to measure development, and it's very difficult to measure development in that true definition because there's so many things going on there. And so the reduced, right, the simplified version is just to measure the size of the economy, right? So even by doing that, we're encountering so many issues, right, just by doing that. So measuring the size of the economy usually is done with a few kind of statistics or indicators like gross domestic product or gross national product and gross national income. Usually indicators based around the nation state, right, or the country. All right, so GDP and GNP, right, goes gross national product and gross domestic product. There's some differences there between those two, but for our purposes, right, this kind of refers to how much stuff is being bought and sold, right? How many goods and services are being produced and sold on the market, right? And gross national income is kind of like the inverse of that. Is the receiving end is right, is the income that results from all of those things that are bought and sold. All right, so some examples that you might kind of be able to make sense of this from your own life is, like you might have been in a car accident at some point, right? Whether or not that's your fault or whatever, right? Or like some other kind of thing that was not good for you, right? Like getting sick, right? We've all gotten sick probably at some point. So if you get in a car wreck, right, you don't really think of that as being a good thing, right, for you personally, but you did a good thing because by getting in that car accident, you have increased the size of the economy, right? And how that happens is by getting in a car wreck, money had to then be spent repairing the car. Money had to be spent to, maybe address some of, like if you got injured or something, right? So money had to get spent. And so goods and services were produced and exchanged, and money changed hands. And that actually increased the size of the economy just a little bit, right? Your little car accident increased the size of the economy. And so if we're looking at development and economic growth as being the same thing, then by getting in that car accident, you actually contributed to increasing the development of your country, right? And so if we look at it that way, right, it kind of sounds ridiculous, right? But that is essentially the logic that's built in to using economic indicators like that as a stand-in for development. So this is a big deal because when it comes to development statistics, usually what happens is countries are classified in like a development ranking according to how much income, or the gross national income or gross national product per capita, right? These are the kind of statistics that are used to determine or to identify if a country is a developed country or a developing country. All right, well, there you go. And so these are some criticisms actually of using economic indicators such as gross national product, gross domestic product, and gross national income. There's criticisms of using those as indicators of development. And these criticism has been like increasing for many years. Even within the economics profession, right? Economists, there's a growing number of economists that are unhappy with the way that they have been used. So there have been some alternative benchmarks or alternative indicators already that have been proposed, right? And so one of those is the United Nations had developed the Human Development Index, or HDI, right? And that takes into account things that are beyond money, right? Beyond economic indicators, right? So it has to do with things like life expectancy, education levels, nutrition and health services, and this idea of income sufficiency, right? So not just money, but is there enough money to provide, to meet basic needs? And HDI, or Human Development Index, does try to incorporate other kind of things that detract from development, such as inequality, right? So that goes back to that income inequality, where if the size of the economy grows, but all of those benefits are kind of accumulate just in one specific part of the population, then isn't actually development happening. And actually, it means that life is getting worse for those people who are not seeing those benefits. It's not just that life is getting better, right, or income is increasing for those that smaller percentage of people who are getting increased incomes, but it actually means that life gets worse for the other majority of the people. So HDI tries to consider a lot of these things as an alternative way to measure development. All right, so check out, there's a section in that reading about called Criticisms of Development Measures. So make sure you read that. That's a really important part of all of this in order to understand like why are people taking issue with things like GDP and even HDI, right? The HDI, it sounds really good, right? But there are also some issues there. Okay, so the main issue, right, even including both GDP and HDI, right? HDI sounds like it is in a lot of ways, it's a vast improvement. But both GDP and HDI don't relate directly to variations in the quality of life, right? They kind of reflect on kind of various statistical categories, but they don't really reflect on what's happening every day in people's lives, right? It's still, in some ways, it's a proxy, right? You're trying to kind of indirectly access something, right? Which is what are people's everyday lives like? And are people's lives getting better? So this brings us to another issue with those conventional economic indicators such as GDP and GNI, or kind of just production statistics and income statistics. Another issue then is that these statistics, they're not actually an accurate indicator of how much production and how much work is going on, right? So even if, right, let's just pause for a second and like think, okay, development, right, means making a life better for everybody, right? So we got to think about all these things that contribute to quality of life. There's economic growth, right, which is the size of the economy, right? So we've already established that that's not a really good way to try to measure development just by measuring the economy, right? Because the economy can grow and like life can be actually getting worse. But in another way, right, let's just pause and let's just look at the economy itself. And those indicators like GDP and GNI, they don't actually accurately measure all of the work and all of the production that's actually going on. So even in the first place, they don't even accurately measure the size of the economy. All right, and what I'm talking about here and what you'll find in the reading is something called the informal sector, right? That's what the reading refers to, is the informal sector. And so these are people who are producing goods, producing services, selling things for money, right? And making, cash incomes. But it's all kind of in an informal economy. These are not things that are formally recorded in a formal economy, right? Like kind of, we have some like other kind of phrases that you might be more familiar with, like under the table, right? Things like that. So like in your own daily life, right? You might have like paid somebody, paid your neighbor, to help you out with something, right? You've participated in an informal economy. If you've ever gone to a garage sale or a yard sale, bought some clothes from somebody in their front yard, right? That's part of the informal economy, right? And so it happens all over the world, right? It's a big thing. But in a lot of countries that have lower official recorded incomes, like those sort of so-called developing countries, the informal economy is actually a huge part of the actual real economy, and it goes completely unaccounted. So the reading, the chapter that I've given you, right, kind of talks about how the official economy, whose measurements serve as the main indicators of growth, may be only a minor part of the real economy, whose true measurements are unknown. This brings us to talking more specifically about Oceania. And what does this all mean for Oceania? So I mentioned in the previous lesson that development professionals would look at something like the village mode of production, and they would not like it, right? They didn't like, this is something that does not look, that people wouldn't like, right? And I said that, why would development professionals not like village mode of production? Or in other words, why would they think that it's bad that people have a choice to work in the formal economy or to participate in that traditional economy that we talked about, which village mode of production is really all about? So here's what it means is that, so the village mode of production, right, which this is where land, right, is owned and controlled by people, right, by the community. Land, labor, and capital, right? Here's our three factors of production, right? Land, labor, capital. So land is like that customary land. It cannot be sold. And access to it is controlled by those socio-cultural customs. Labor is people, right? Your own work, right? Who decides what to do to work that land and produce things, right? It's not really a boss telling people what to do. It's kind of an equally democratically agreed upon process of, what kind of work has to be done and what kind of things are going to be produced. And it's usually like focused on the community. Remember that this is like group oriented, like community oriented identity, right? So everything it's less individualistic and it's more group oriented. And then capital, right? That's all the supplies, right? So that's all of your materials, tools, raw materials, resources, natural resources, right? That capital, right? That's all owned and controlled by the community. So that's village mode of production. That is kind of separate and it's different than a capitalist economy. So we're already starting off with a so-called problem for development professionals, where the starting point for development in Oceania, just like anywhere in the world, has been the goal to increase the size of the economy, because we're starting from the assumption that to increase development, that we have to increase the size of the economy, and therefore we have to increase production of goods and services for sale on the formal market, right? That is like the whole logic, like put together in one thing, right? Like, so we've completely gone and forgotten at this point in this chain of logic, right, that true original meaning of development. And we're all focused, right? All of those policies have now focused pretty much on economic growth. So here's where the problem comes in, is that the village mode of production meant that people had a choice. They did not have to go work full-time permanently in formal jobs just to survive, right? Because of the village mode of production, because of access to customary land, and because of participation in the community, that basic needs were being met. Okay, the fact that they didn't have to work full-time every day in a formal job, that didn't mean that they were lazy, right? Or that didn't mean that they were just living off of someone else. It meant that they were already self-reliant. They did not have to rely on the formal economy to just survive. There was already self-reliance. And in that way, this is another way of thinking about freedom and independence that you might not be so familiar with, but there was freedom to choose what kind of livelihood you wanted to engage in. So this all meant that Pacific Islanders, right, indigenous Pacific Islanders, were not completely wrapped up in the project of creating this new formal economy. This is the problem for development professionals, because how do you get economic growth? Economic growth is when workers are there creating the value, right? So remember from the reading that you're going to read, and I just mentioned a few minutes ago, right? Economic growth happens when all of those resources, when land and labor, right? This is people, right? Workers. And when all of that equipment, all the materials, all the capital, right, is put to use as much as possible to produce goods and services for sale in the market. So economic growth happens when, in this case, if Pacific Islanders were working all the time in formal jobs, that is when economic growth is going to happen. And if you are a target worker, right? We mentioned target worker in a previous lesson. Go back and check that out if you've forgotten, right? So if you're a target worker, you're only contributing a little bit to economic growth, right? Because then you're going back to the village mode of production and doing your own thing again with your community. So in Oceania, right, for so long, there was exchange, right? But there wasn't market exchange. Land also was held in common, and work was performed for others in reciprocal fashion, right? Kind of an exchange, right? You work for me, I'll do something for you. For the most part, this led to sustainable island communities, and in areas of even very small land, right? Small atolls, right? Generations were able to work, and resources were not extinguished, right? There was not unsustainable use, right? No overharvesting. So what developmentalists, right, or development professionals, what they felt that they really needed was for Pacific Islanders to participate fully in that market economy. They wanted people to be working in the stores, right? Working as cashiers or clerks, or, you know, restocking shelves in those stores that were being created, or working on agricultural plantations, right? Producing, right, without one type of crop as much as possible. But here's the catch, is that because of the village mode of production, and because of that built-in safety net to the culture with the land, people didn't have to take those jobs, right? So if the pay wasn't that good, you know, they could look at that job and say, they could look at, well, what's the kind of work that they're going to have to do, and what kind of wage they're going to get for that. And they could look at it and say, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm not going to do it. If the wage increased, then, you know, they could take it. This is what we mean when I say that there's freedom or self-reliance to choose what kind of livelihood to engage in. Right. Also, if you're an agricultural producer, right, a farmer, and you're producing for, you know, crops for sale, you don't have to, if the price of that crop, right, kind of decrease, like the market price, if it drops too low, you don't have to spend all your time producing just to make just to make less money. You can just stop production altogether because you have that safety net built in. You can work in the village mode of production meeting all of your needs, and you don't have to do all of that extra work for such little pay. This was all a huge problem for development professionals because by doing that, by having that choice, it was not contributing to the potential for economic growth. So in a very weird way, development professionals, right, ultimately what they wanted to happen was to get people to work as much as possible in the formal market economy. And as long as they had that village mode of production, as long as they had that, then they had the choice. So in a very weird way, in order to increase the potential for economic growth, ultimately what had to happen was to remove that choice, right? This is how economies grow. And actually, this is how economies around the rest of the world had already kind of grown into what they are today, is that the choice was taken away. If people don't have access to land, if they don't have access to a community to produce all of their basic needs, then they have no choice but to work in that market economy, right? And again, right, if you are the person that if you are engaged in income generation, right, it's fine, right? But for a lot of people, as I hopefully I have pointed out, meeting basic needs was already a built-in part of society. You didn't have to work in a terrible, low-paying, dangerous job just to survive. So for development professionals, separating people from the means of production, right? Separating people from that land and from having control over their own labor and control over their own capital, that as actually would have been not a publicized agenda, but that's really one of the things that was working behind the scenes. And this was one of the motivations for really outside influences trying to convert customary land into private property that could be sold, right? So, on the one hand, there's the assumption in a capitalist economy that private property is one of the key sources for economic growth. Okay, but one of the reasons for that is if people are separated from land and they're separated from the ability to provide their own basic needs, then they have no choice but to become employees, right? You have to become a worker to get a paycheck in order to meet those basic needs. And at the same time, by being a worker, you are contributing to economic growth. Because remember, if an entrepreneur is starting up a store in a Pacific Island city, it's only going to grow its business by hiring people, right? You've got to hire people in order to grow the business because people have to be there working in the store in order for it to work, in order for the store to actually function. And so if people have no incentive to work there, then your business is not going to grow. All right. So how do you do that? Well, you can either incentivize them, right? You can pay them more, right? You can provide that incentive through higher pay, or it could come through, as a society, people removing that choice, right? Removing the ability to provide basic needs so that your only choice to meet basic needs is to be working in a formal wage earning job. Because of this, for many years, customary land was called an obstacle to development in Oceania and probably in other parts of the world too. This is a very unfortunate thing, and it's been kind of, in recent years, people have started to change their minds about this, right? In the development profession. Okay, but for many years, development professionals saw customary land as an obstacle for development because that land, it couldn't be enrolled into economic growth. The customary land was not being used to produce economic growth in the two ways that growth happens because of that land, right? The one way that growth happens is if that land is sold, right? It becomes a commodity, right? That it can be used and the value of the land can increase and it can be sold, right? That's the one way that private property contributes to economic growth. The other way that it would contribute to growth is if you remove customary land from a community's livelihood, then people don't have the choice of meeting basic needs through customary land or through working in the wage paying job, right? They only have to, you have to create a life where people pay rent to just have a place to live, or then they have to buy land to have a place to live. And in order to do either one of those things, you need money, right? So by removing customary land, it would then cause people to be in a type of livelihood that requires them to have money just to live. And in order to have money just to live, you have to be working all the time, right? And so that is actually how economic growth fundamentally starts. And so that's why customary land was called an obstacle to growth for many years. The reason this has changed is because countries like Vanuatu, around the year 2010, they started to look at things a little differently. And they said, actually, it was a different kind of indicator that came out called the Happy Planet Index. And the Happy Planet Index kind of ranked countries based on happiness, right? How happy people were. And Vanuatu is actually at the very top. It was like that's supposed to be the place where people are the happiest, kind of referring to like their needs are being met. There's a kind of low stress, right? That kind of thing. And so leaders of the country kind of looked at that and said, we're first on the Happy Planet Index, but we're actually ranked as like one of the lowest developed countries, right? And assumed that our livelihoods are pretty bad because we have very low incomes. So that is the people in the actual government kind of looked at that and said, there's a huge disparity between economic indicators and then the actual levels of well-being, right? Or development. So they started to recognize that economic indicators such as gross domestic product and gross national income do not actually indicate the level of well-being of a population. And so then they set out to actually develop alternative indicators of well-being that actually worked for their own country or for their own region, right? So they developed a big survey called Alternative Indicators of Well-Being for Melanesia, right? And so these indicators are supposed to be culturally specific and are supposed to be indicators of are basic needs being met and in which way, and are people actually happy? Do they have access to clean water? Or is there access to healthy food? Is there access to a vibrant community? If you have income, if you have economic growth, but those other things actually decrease or worsen, then you don't have development, right? That's what they're essentially saying, is that if you increase incomes, but you're only increasing incomes by putting people in a situation where they have to pay rent and they don't have access to customary land, then how can you call that development? How can you call that a good thing? And if you want economic growth to happen, then you should actually provide an incentive for people, right, in terms of like increased incomes, rather than asking people to privatize and sell their land and disconnect them from that basic safety net that has existed for thousands of years. So their alternative indicators were kind of based in the notion of there should be no kind of economic growth that forces Melanesian communities to have to give up or abandon things like customary land, right? And so the way of thinking started to change and began to see customary land not as an obstacle for development, but as the foundation on which development can actually happen.
If you measure wealth in terms of clean air, clean food, clean water, unpolluted, Vanuatu has those in abundance. Everything our existing non-Western culture values is not worth anything in terms of money. GDP measures value only in terms of money, cash. So by using GDP as a measure of well-being, effectively you're discounting everything that exists in the traditional economy, the way people live, the way they're sustained and make their livelihoods. So in that way, I think GDP as the sole measure of well-being is very destructive of our living traditional cultures. Wealth measured in terms of the indicators we developed for Vanuatu, which is access to customary land, participation in ceremonies that create this social safety net around you. Also indicators to do with clean air, clean food, clean water, safe community. We already have all of that. And so the whole point is let's engage in a kind of development where we preserve all of that stuff. What has generally happened with development is that you develop in a way that destroys all of that good stuff. And then you get to a stage where you realize that's what you want. And then you've got to find a way to get back there. So in Vanuatu, we really got to be very serious about realizing that we have it already. We just need to protect it and make sure that the benefits that can come from orthodox development, and I mean things like access to technologies that improve communication and improve health, improve well-being, greater understanding of science, for example, to be able to put it alongside our traditional knowledge to better understand how the world works. Those kinds of things, we need to be very careful in how we pick and choose what we take on Vanuatu to assist our development so that we can have the best of both worlds.
Here's an example from Papua New Guinea. A community advocacy organization called Act Now has a video about preserving customary land, and I'm just going to narrate the video with the words on the screen. Don't register your customary land. Customary land is our most important asset and is very valuable. It already sustains an economy worth 40 billion kina per year. That is why a lot of outsiders want to take it away from us. Logging, mining, palm oil, real estate, construction, all want our customary land, and together they have on their side foreign governments, the banks, and many politicians. Together they tell a lot of lies. They say customary land is idle, undeveloped, a wasted resource. A lie. Customary land sustains over 7 million people in thousands of communities. They say customary land has no value. Another lie. Customary land is very valuable. Annual economy, customary land. Annual economy, other sectors. 40 billion kina compared with 7 billion kina. They say customary land is an obstacle to development. A lie. Customary land is the resource on which we must build our development. The real barriers to development are corruption and a government focus on helping foreign companies. They say logging, oil palm, tuna canning, and other industries will bring development. Another lie. These industries do not bring development. They bring environmental and social destruction and disempower communities. They say land registration will protect your customary land. A lie. Incorporating land groups and voluntary land registration makes customary land easier to steal. They say land registration empowers rural communities, but rural people are already empowered and strong. Land registration disempowers communities and makes them vulnerable. The truth is, land registration leads to dispossession and poverty. Don't register your customary land. Don't give away your future. So this was by Act Now, a community advocacy organization, an example of community groups advocating for customary land rights.